As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
So the idea is that the more moral you behave according to the virtues of Confucianism, within this virtuous system, you will inherently move to the top. The problem with this is it's a hierarchy based on an assumption that the people who move up are going to be the most virtuous. But because, unlike sort of a lot of the Western theories like teleology and deontology, there's no way of checking, right? There's no way of measuring sincerity. And so by simply being at the top, the person higher up can say, well, I inherently know better than you how to interpret what is the right thing to do in this situation. So therefore, like, I'm right and you're wrong.
From the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, welcome to another episode of the Security Nexus Webinar, where we explore the most pressing security challenges and geopolitical shifts shaping our world today. I'm your host, James Minnich, Colonel of the United States Army retired and professor here at DKI APCSS. It's a pleasure to have you with us for this insightful conversation in episode 23, China's Strategic Culture, Confucianism or Realpolitik. In this session, we aim to explore the intricate blend of philosophical thought and pragmatic strategy that underpins China's actions in international affairs. The central question we address is whether China's strategic culture is primarily guided by the principles of Confucianism or by the more pragmatic realities of Realpolitik. Realpolitik, a term originating from 19th century European political discourse, refers to a system of politics or principles based on practical rather than moral or ideological consideration. It involves making decisions that prioritize power, security, and the state's interests, often at the expense of ethical or philosophical ideals. This concept is frequently contrasted with approaches that emphasize moral or ideological commitments. China's strategic behavior today is not merely a reaction to recent history, but is deeply rooted in a rich mosaic of dynastic rule, philosophical thought, and cultural evolution. China's approach to governance and international relations is deeply influenced by strategies developed by ancient Chinese empires centuries ago. These historical influences provide a foundation for understanding China's long-term strategies and current actions on the world stage. Confucianism plays a central role in shaping China's identity. It is a philosophy that emphasizes harmony, stability, and moral governance. These values have profoundly influenced both domestic policies and international relations. However, Confucianism also supports the use of authority and, when necessary, force to maintain social order and safeguard the collective good. This duality raises an intriguing question. How does China reconcile its commitment to harmony with its readiness to use force? Another significant aspect of Confucian thought is the emphasis on the collective good over individual rights. This principle can sometimes come into tension with global norms, particularly in areas concerning human rights and individual freedoms. Domestically, this emphasis on collectivism informs China's approach to social stability and governance, while internationally, it influences its diplomatic interactions and strategic decisions. China's strategic actions, including its policies in the South China Sea and its Belt and Road Initiative, perhaps reflect a blend of Confucian values and Realpolitik. These actions may not just be tactical responses to immediate circumstances, but part of a broader strategy rooted in China's historical traditions and its evolving role in international dynamics. To delve deeper into these critical issues, I'm pleased to welcome our esteemed guest, Dr. Lucas Filler, professor here at DKI APCSS, and an expert on the strategic logic and implications of China's decisions and behaviors. Lucas, welcome to today's episode. Glad to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, many of our guests will remember that you appeared in our first episode many months ago. So by practice, we like to invite our guests to tell us about their journey, how they came here. So share with us your story.
Absolutely, thanks. So I think what really got me interested in sort of Chinese ethics in foreign relations and the use of force was my own experience in the US Navy. So I started out as a P-3 pilot, and I joined before 9/11, but certainly after 9/11, I spent most of my time in Iraq, Afghanistan, places like that. And I kind of had two big takeaways. One was that despite our efforts to help, there were times where our lack of understanding of the other cultures meant that our efforts were less effective than they could have been, because we would try to give them what we thought they might want, and maybe got that somewhat wrong from time to time. And then the other thing I saw was that modern high-tech warfare means that very few people, if anyone, even within the US military, see the full picture. And so there's a presumption that if we all do our job and we do our role, then we get the bad guy, we protect the innocent, and we keep ourselves safe. And I think we did a good job of that. However, what I realized is we're good at following the laws, the rules of engagement, but because there was never a big picture, the morality of what we did was not quite as clear. And so I wanted to look at those, but at that time, which was 2005, there were a lot of people, like smart people, who were starting to kind of look at those issues in the Middle East. And so I kind of looked around and said, well, where else are there large cultural and language differences and possibly increasing tensions where a lack of understanding could make things worse than they otherwise would be? And I said China. Yeah. So I applied to grad school to study comparative ethics and basically foreign policy and war. And from there, spent a couple of years in China doing field research, trying to understand the Chinese approach to conflict resolution initially, very broadly, and then focused down over the years to sort of Chinese views on the use of force.
So before you came here to APCSS, you were working for the government somewhere. Where were you?
That's right, yeah. So almost my entire military, or almost entire professional career has been working for the DoD in some form or another, except for grad school. So I was at Indo-Pacific Command, where I was running the internal sort of China think tank that advised the 4-star commander. And our focus was strategic. In other words, why is China doing what it's doing rather than what is China doing what it's doing?
Well, we're going to get into some of that here. Why are they doing what they're doing? And so let me go ahead and get us started and preface this first question I want to ask you by scoping it into the deep roots of strategy. So China's strategic thinking isn't just about the century of humiliation. I mean, it's a mosaic that's shaped by ancient dynasties and philosophies, as you well know. So here's the question then. How do those deeper historical roots influence China's actions on the world stage today?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, within sort of this very niche world of strategic culture, and even more specific Chinese strategic culture, the first thing that sort of most people start with is basic international relations theory, where states are rational actors, meaning that they pursue what they think are their best interests in the smartest, most effective way possible. So what happens when someone sees a state do something and does not seem rational? So strategic culture argues that it may not seem rational to the outsider because they're missing some context. And that context is the culture, history, language, geography, things like that. And that sort of acts as a lens for which decision makers sort of use to view and then come up with answers to how best to pursue their country's interests. And if you don't share that culture, you may not understand that. And so for China, China's been around for several thousand years. And there's a couple different sort of strands of thought that many scholars who look at this believe are really important to consider. And one of them is that whether it's recent history or thousands of years ago, China has not been blessed with good geography. And so, for example, right now it has 14 land borders, the most of any country in the world. And if you go back thousands of years, it has also sort of had moments of peace punctuated by largely, if not severe threats on one or many sides, but internal unrest, various disturbances which have led to two things. One is the sense that it is beset on all sides by existential threats. Even the smallest potential threat could rapidly escalate into something major. And then the idea that it needs to sort of address these threats aggressively. And so there is, on one hand, this very what we would say political realist or realpolitik view of how things work. But China has claimed within the last 20, 30, 50 years officially that it is a uniquely pacifistic country and culture because of Confucianism, which when you make a bold statement like that, the first thing any good academic does is dig into the facts. And what they found basically was that China, over the course of its history, is no more or less warlike than any other culture or country, meaning it's quite warlike. So the question then becomes, does China believe that it is uniquely pacifistic? And perhaps, there are extreme circumstances which justify the use of force? Because even in Western ethical theory, we have exceptions, right? Supreme emergency being one of those. Or is China using this as, a way to wrap naked self-interest in more morally acceptable language?
So let's pull on that then. Let's pull on this Confucianism. As you rightly stated, it's often cited as promoting harmony, but it also has strong implications for authority and the use of force. So then let me ask you this question. How does China reconcile these seemingly contradictory aspects of Confucianism in its foreign policy?
Absolutely. So first of all, Confucianism is very important, but it's not the only philosophical tradition that influences Chinese thinking. And even more importantly is the fact that, especially a long time ago, when there were sort of different political factions vying for the emperor's, favor, when Confucianism was not in favor with the emperor, many times it would be legalism, which is a very different, almost opposite sort of political philosophy. So when legalism was sort of in the emperor's favor, Confucians would use legalistic language but still try to promote Confucian ideas and vice versa. And so, I want to caveat that when we talk about sort of Confucian concepts, especially terms, they are easily manipulated and sort of leveraged for insincere purposes. But nonetheless, Confucianism is an idea that, the collective good is the best way to ensure the best lives for the most number of people. And because of that, there's an obligation for every individual to play by the rules of the community, or else the system doesn't work. Because if one person steps away from that, it becomes disruptive and the roles don't function the way that they're supposed to.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Confucianism, I think it probably comes to China during the Han Dynasty. So that's about 2,200 years ago. That's during a couple hundred years BCE. And you talked about when it kind of fell out of vogue and legalism took over. And so the Qing dynasty, which comes in after the Ming dynasty, these are not Hans. And so perhaps there is a reason why, as an example, it's less out of vogue and they fall in on another philosophy. Does that sound about?
Yeah, I'm not actually sure why one philosophy became more popular than others. Certainly there was sort of this competition, but I think also the worldview and the situation, right? So kind of there were times of great conflict, and then once peace was restored, I think that the more peaceful approach, like Confucianism, was more well received because you weren't sort of faced, or they weren't faced with sort of the existential threats that might warrant more legalistic, pragmatic, or amoral behavior.
Yeah, no, I see that. Let's talk a little bit about collectivism versus individual. So Confucian emphasizes the social harmony, and an order can sometimes clash with individual expressions of rights. We hear this frequently as people are making criticisms on this. So maybe here's a question: where do you see the fault lines in this tension that's playing out in this modern Chinese society and its global interactions?
Yeah, so again, that's a little bit into the idea of how much is Confucianism still influencing modern Chinese culture. And I've had a really wide range of reactions when I sort of talk about this issue, because some people look at it and think that that China has, again, manipulated the concepts to sort of, again, validate sort of social control. And so it's not actual real influence. And I think that's not true. I think it depends on sort of what level of analysis you're looking at. So many times when I present this, people will push back on these terms, and yet many, both of our foreign partners who come from Confucian countries, but also a lot of our Asian American colleagues who grew up in families that probably came from a Confucian country. So China, Japan, and South Korea most commonly, they'll all nod their head enthusiastically. And we have a lot of Taiwan folks who come in and also agree that within the social structure, they may not use those terms, but the ideas are still very present, right? And those ideas really, because they're based on 5 fundamental relationships, at the time of Confucius, in order to sort of help everyone, even the uneducated peasant, understand what proper behavior within this community is. They set it up to be basically family dynamics, right? And it's outdated, but most importantly, it's hierarchical, right? But it's considered a moral hierarchy. So the idea is whether it's within the family or taking that same family model of, parent-child, or older sibling, younger sibling, or 2 friends who are basically peers. These can be extrapolated and are extrapolated to not just the individual or the specific family, but also to the larger community, as well as to the people, the citizens, and their government. So the idea is that the more moral you behave according to the virtues of Confucianism, within this virtuous system, you will inherently move to the top. The problem with this is it's a hierarchy based on an assumption that the people who move up are going to be the most virtuous. But because, unlike sort of a lot of the Western theories like teleology and deontology, there's no way of checking, right? There's no way to measuring sincerity. And so besides simply being at the top, the person higher up can say, well, I inherently know better than you how to interpret what is the right thing to do in this situation. So therefore, like, I'm right and you're wrong. And so there's no equality, which in Western, theory, we're the basic building block of our society and really of our sort of social contract is the individual, right? It's about the individual and their rights and the protection of those rights in order to let each individual figure out the best way for them to flourish or to thrive. And so in Confucianism, it's about the community and your responsibilities to the community. So the problem becomes, as China has become more modernized and more capitalist, how do you balance the good of the community over sort of the good of the individual, especially when you've been burned, as a society by ideals before our ideology, right? So China, the government, the CCP, has, over the course of the last 20, 30, 40 years, has regularly sort of turned back to Confucianism. And there's been a lot of desire for that by Chinese citizens because there's a general sense that the kids these days have no morality. There's no character being instilled in them. It's basically just about getting rich, right? To get rich is glorious, right? And so there is a desire to have both younger people sort of learn more socially conscious approaches, social norms, but also it's a way of sort of creating a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning that many people turn to religion to. On the other hand, the problem with that is that it's also manipulated by the CCP to basically maintain the status quo, where the CCP says, we are the moral hierarchy, we're at the top, and we will adjudicate, everyone else's behavior. And because it's completely subjective, they can use it to their advantage to perpetuate the hierarchy. And then of course there's the recent Cultural Revolution, which showed what happens when you give people ideology and then let them run amok. And so there's the CCP is not willing to let Confucianism sort of blossom on its own. It has to be in the service of the party state, which again takes away some of the legitimacy. And so just as a side note, living in China, I was surprised at how many times Chinese people would take me aside and basically ask me about my religion, because there is a lot of interest, especially in Christianity, but also in Judaism, from ordinary Chinese people. And I think it speaks to their desire for, some kind of spiritual part of their life that isn't there, right? Because in China, religion is illegal.
You said a lot there, Lucas. I'm pulling a few of those pieces. Your first point about living in and studying in China. There's a lot of people thinking about going to do that, and they just are not going to have the opportunities that you had then because of the tensions that exist now. I too spent a lot of years living. I spent 15 years living in Korea, and I can attest to the things that you spoke about. That Confucianism is evident in daily interactions of how people behave. This is unlike, if you're going to make a comparison. This is unlike, a Christian who goes to church on Easter. I mean, they get out there once a year. These people who live in their interactions, the way they speak is hierarchical, the way they really, and so they really is I would state an ingrained part of their lives. And yet, I think as you rightly noted, there's often this, if you don't have something, if you're denied something, or in this case, Christianity or Judaism or something else, then there's a desire to know more and wonder what you're missing out on. That was really insightful. I wonder if we could pull on a little bit more of what you're talking about and talk about the good of the nation, which, in your words you're talking about, China prioritizes the collective good over the individual rights. And so this raises questions about where is this line drawn? So what are the ethical implications then of this approach, both as we think domestically in China's dealings, but also in domestic dealings, but also with the other nations?
Absolutely. So, again, the idea of what's best for the community is best for the most number of individuals.
Okay.
It's sort of one of the primary factors that I think is considered when the party state thinks about sort of how to manage potential disruptions to harmony, right? So there's this high sensitivity to threat, which I spoke of earlier. And then there's a sense that, the economic sort of prosperity is probably the most important component for the average Chinese person in the mind of the party. And so, that is prioritized over other aspects of what we might call spiritual flourishing. And I think that there are certainly plenty of Chinese people who don't appreciate that. I think that they miss those things. But I think also the Chinese approach to collectivism, because it's hierarchical, it means that sort of there's no way to seek justice, right? So if you are on the lower side of the hierarchy in whatever dispute it might be, you don't really have the opportunity to seek, justice. And, and the part of that's because the way that China philosophically defines justice is totally different than the way that we do. So, in the West, we sort of look at, there's a couple of different definitions, but one of the most popular is sort of John Rawls one, which is justice is equality, which is basically fairness, right? And fairness is based on the idea that you have two different people and they have equal rights, right? And so you adjudicate based on that. In Confucianism, there is not that sense of equality. And so justice is not all that important, and it's certainly not conceived in the same way. So if you're lower in the hierarchy and you have a dispute, there's no way to find a solution. But because of that, it's much more acceptable to find ways around the problem, right? So ideally in Confucianism, when there's a disagreement, both parties are expected to accommodate, compromise, and avoid the issue. However, the person who's higher in the hierarchy obviously has more discretion to not do that. And so what happens is the person more junior has no say. And so as long as they don't sort of cross the lines of the intent behind whatever the senior person prohibited, it is much more acceptable for them to find a way around the problem.
I want to revert back to something you said earlier to pull on this one here. You had spoke about the kings and how, you rise to the top, and maybe what was to check them and to make sure that they actually behaved right. And my, studying of it was that it was pretty much their how they're going to be remembered in history. And so people are going to write it down, and so they kind of like, I want to make sure that years later my legacy is that I'm remembered as a good king. Now that checks some, didn't check all, and probably checked people differently. And perhaps even in this more pedestrian example of daily lives, I wonder how much, and it can be individual dependent without a doubt, but people are checked by, whatever face they're trying to save in their own community and stuff. And so the things that check are different, but probably there is a bit of something there to try to hold a society in check, even though you have the difference in social standings and stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there's two thoughts that come to mind. Remind me what the second one is, I'll probably forget. And the second one is basically like, how does a ruler stay a ruler and how do they get replaced? But the first aspect of this is the idea of face, right? Which is incredibly important. There's a couple sort of principles within Confucianism, face being one, and rituals being another one.
Yeah.
And they're actually, I think as terms of targeting human nature, they're very clever, right? Because face is based on the idea in Confucianism that humans are either neither inherently good nor bad, or they are inherently good, depending upon the Confucian scholar. Whereas, as you know, in the West, we have this original sin, the idea that humans are inherently flawed, are going to do flawed things.
Right.
And so one of the sort of implications of this is in Confucianism, the idea is if you want to encourage people to be moral, if you want to encourage them to have good character and integrity, punishing them does not teach them that lesson. What teaches people those lessons better is proper moral education and role models. And so, of course, the people higher up who are supposed to be more moral, more Confucian, are the ones who set the examples, but also sort of teach how to behave. So what happens when someone sort of doesn't comply? Well, the idea, again, is punishment's not the most effective method. And so face, shame, embarrassment is sort of a more preferred means because it's a little bit softer. It also creates less conflict within a relationship and thus within the community, which preserves, the stability of the community so that it doesn't bother, everyone. If there's a dispute between two people in a village, if it's an overt dispute, it can have huge impacts on everyone around. But if both people are avoiding it and just kind of moving on, ideally, it's not as sort of destructive and disturbing. And then for the idea of sort of what's the sort of motivation for anyone, but especially people higher up in the hierarchy to behave well, that gets to some really interesting problems, and we see over history that gets abused because there's an amazing sort of catch-22, which is that you've heard of the mandate of heaven.
Yes.
And basically the idea is that if you are the most moral, you rise to the top. And if you fail to do what a moral Confucian ruler is supposed to do, which is essentially take care of your people, then you have forfeit your right and your authority to rule. You've lost the mandate of heaven. But the only way to actually know when a ruler, because it's subjective, what is the best way to interpret these, the only way to know that the ruler has departed from Confucian teachings and is now manipulating it for his own good is if he loses power. Because if he's overthrown, that is clearly because he no longer is doing his job and the people have risen up. And so there's a lot of incentive for the ruler to do whatever they need to do to stay in power, because by doing that, they've proven that they deserve to stay in power.
Oh, fascinating. I'm glad you pulled on that. Let's talk about Confucian conflict. While Confucianism values peaceful resolutions, as we've been speaking about, I mean, China employs various tools from its economic leverage to its military might. You could argue most countries do that. So how does China decide when to rely on soft power versus hard tactics in pursuing its goals?
Absolutely. So that gets to the other aspect, which is the ritual, right?
Yeah.
So the ritual, and this is not uncommon in sort of other cultures and certainly religions as well, is the physical manifestation of beliefs and practices don't actually do anything. but they mean a lot. And in part, what they do and mean is it helps the doer internalize whatever it is that they're doing. So, when you take the wafer, no one actually thinks that's the body of Christ, but it is a way of like really deeply instilling more than just saying something, a belief. And so for Confucianism, there are a lot of prescribed rituals that are meant to, one, reinforce proper behavior and proper decision making in the individuals, but it's also a way of sort of showing publicly that you subscribe to this belief system, that you're a team player, and thus you are not a threat to the community, the good of the community, and this whole belief system. And so in traditional sort of Chinese foreign policy, we've heard of the tributary sort of idea. And so that was the idea that if China is a moral state, a moral culture, and they develop Confucianism, then of course they are the most moral because that and many other impressive inventions have come from them. And so other countries should recognize this, and if they don't, just like we talked about before, then clearly they're not moral because they don't understand what is moral. And so that needs to be corrected, right? And so that would be done initially with faith and things like that. Now, how does a country show that it does understand the moral superiority of this belief system, right? This political system. And that is they go through these rituals, right? I think it's had a bad name now, but like kowtow, right?
Right.
But really what it is these smaller states are trying to do, they're supposed to do these physical things that show others, mostly the Chinese, especially the emperor, but also show their own people, and also further instills into their own people that there is a hierarchy, there's a moral hierarchy. And so by bringing sort of small tributes to the emperor, they were, it didn't have to be anything expensive or substantial. I mean, the more, the better. But the point was to show that you recognized physically, and in public, the moral superiority of the Chinese Confucian system. If you didn't do that, then it showed that you didn't buy into that system, and thus you are a threat to that system. You're a threat to the stability of the region, and thus, the well-being of all the people. And so in modern times, I don't think it's the same, but I definitely see, vestiges of it in how China reacts. In part, I have a whole collection of quotes about China talking about small countries. Obviously, there's the super famous one from, I think it was 2013, where China's a big country and you're a small country, and that's just a fact, right? But we see it everywhere. And again, in ideal Chinese theory, it's a moral hierarchy. The problem is, if people don't acknowledge this through these rituals, etc., China then has to make a stronger correction, right? And this is where the idea of sort of barbarians come in. It's the idea that there are certain people who are never going to get it because they're just not sophisticated enough. And in that case, ranging on different sort of scholars and interpretations, at a minimum, force is approved. Coercion is better because it's, once again, it doesn't create the same disruption to everybody, the whole system, the well-being of the country and the region. But if coercion doesn't work, and that force is acceptable, and in part it's because as barbarians, they'll never get it. They've demonstrated that they don't recognize the superiority of the system. They haven't been enculturated, and so sort of the rules of Confucianism no longer apply to the same degree. Now, ideally, according to Confucian writing, it should, right? I mean, Confucianism is pacifistic or fairly pacifistic, but then again, so is Christianity before St. Augustine. And so, when I went into this, I started by saying, like, it's not, a lot of the prior scholars had looked at when China used force and said, if they do it when it's in their best interests, then it's probably, just an excuse. And if they do it, if they restrain their self-interest where they could use force, but they don't, then maybe it's more sincere. And I agree with that, but I was like, you also have to think about, in the West, not only do we, reinterpreted a pacifistic religion, but we still are, evolving, just war theory, the laws of armed combat. There are exceptions within there that allow us to do things that we otherwise think are morally unacceptable. And so we have to give the same benefit of the doubt to the Chinese philosophy. And so ultimately, the way I look at it is consistency and coherence. Essentially what I kind of mentioned before, which is, again, pretty straight from Rawls. The idea that, if a person or a country has certain beliefs and their actions uphold those beliefs, when it is not in their personal best interest to do so, it's more likely to be sincere over, time and a pattern of behavior.
You and I have talked many times over the years, and I have always valued the way that you look at an issue without, blinders on, as if though the rest of the world isn't, also occurring while you're scrutinizing an issue. And so you brought some of that in here, and I appreciate it. When you spoke about rituals, and I don't think it matters whether you're talking about Confucian rituals or Christian rituals, I've come to find in my life that rituals are an outward expression of an inward feeling. And so you spoke about it, the gift was the outward expression.
Mm-hmm.
It's less important how much was given, because that should represent the way you expect them to feel with inside. And that was, showing deference up. So I really appreciated that. Let's talk about hierarchy. We spoke around it. So hierarchy and diplomacy. China emphasizes hierarchy in its relationship, as you've been speaking throughout this. So the question then is this: how does this impact China's interactions with countries that don't share the hierarchical worldview that it's putting forward?
Yeah, so there have been some who argue that political realism and Confucianism are at odds with one another, and in some ways they are. But I also think in one way that they're not is, hierarchy is sort of power in modern days, and so I think for China, it needs to achieve the China dream of national rejuvenation, which is loosely reassuming what it believes to be its rightful place at the top of at least the regional hierarchy, if not the global hierarchy. And the second sort of aspect of that I think is less appreciated is, the first one is that is generally measured in influence. But the other aspect is reputation. It has to be recognized as a great power, not just have the influence of a great power. And those are at times a little bit diametrically opposed, because sometimes what you need to do to influence may not actually make you liked. And so there is, again, this bleed over of things like legalism and Realpolitik into that. But the other aspect of it, I think, is that there's a belief, like I said, from thousands of years, that it is a dog-eat-dog, zero-sum competition world where, every country is fighting over limited, largely natural resources, and those who get it become more powerful and survive, and those who don't fall down on the hierarchy. And so there's a bit of a blending here of the moral hierarchy and the pragmatic hierarchy. And again, it comes down to, I think, not entirely, but it's certainly consistent with the idea of, no one judges what's the right thing to do better than the people at the top of the hierarchy. And so for China, and this is where, when I first started looking at China, I went into it, a little bit naive, but very idealistic. It was like, this is just one big misunderstanding. And now, many years later, 20 years later, I still think it is a big misunderstanding, but I'm much less optimistic about fixing that misunderstanding. And I think it's because there's everyone and every culture does it, the mirroring, right? So we interpret things through the lenses of what's familiar to us. And so, I see this very often with how the US talks about China, and I see it a lot about how China talks about the US. So in China, there's so much cynicism about human nature, about the nature of states, the nature of international relations, that it's easy for even the most idealistic behaviors to be interpreted as the worst behaviors. And so, when I started out, I was generally in the engagement camp. And I think that was the right thing to do, right? Because if we're going to be moral people who, ask for a moral foreign policy sort of approach, then we do the right thing first. And what I think is that and I don't think anyone in China actually said it in these words, but I think this was sort of the cognitive story was, if it's a dog-eat-dog world and the United States is at the top, of course the United States is going to do whatever it needs to do to stay at the top. And again, natural resources being incredibly important for this. And the United States has done a good job in, this generic Chinese view of using sort of moral language to make naked self-interest much more appealing. And so when we were sort of in this engagement period, my sense is China sort of said, and they call it like, a window of strategic opportunity, right? And that was more referencing sort of when we were distracted by the Middle East. But I think it's still consistent. The idea was, I think the Chinese were like, this is a dog-eat-dog world. The United States, usually plays really dirty. They're trying to play nice right now. Like, I don't know why, but they're being suckers, and we should take advantage of this as much as we can, because soon enough, they're going to wake up to like, whatever they're foolishly thinking right now, and they're going to go back trying to contain and dominate the rest of the world. And so, like, let's get what we can while we can. And so, sure enough, after a bunch of years, most of us, myself included, were like, no, this engagement thing is not working. China is taking everything it can take. They're eating our lunch. We need to be tough, because all that China, understands is power, right? And I agree with that because of all these sort of realist, perspectives and historical perspectives. But the problem is, then, this hypothetical China entity that's watching us is like, I knew it. United States is this big, powerful bully that just wants to do whatever it's in its interest, and now it's showing its true face. And like, I knew it. And so no matter what we do, because to some extent of the lens from which China looks at these things, they're not likely to believe us. And there's plenty of other people who look at, the United States and how we sort of talk about a values-based, governance system, and they might be just as cynical. The argument I make in those cases often is that the United States has to balance, every country has to balance pragmatism and idealism. And at least in the United States, generally speaking, we try to uphold those ideals, to achieve those ideals, and we fall short. Sometimes we fall short deliberately, and sometimes we fall short because we just don't understand the whole picture. But at least we're trying. Whereas a country like China, there's such a pessimistic view that I would argue like the party state doesn't even want to try.
I think I'm going to ask one more question before we move on, and I want to ask about the Middle Kingdom mentality. Now, many people have heard this term Middle Kingdom, but I think I would preface by saying this is not universal through China's historical period that it has felt this way. I mean, I think if you're talking about the warring states, you're talking about whether the Mongols are running or the Manchus. I mean, their location of power is a different spot than there, or even after, during the period of the century of humiliation. But we are probably at a period right now where this Middle Kingdom mentality is risen, and probably rose out of the 2008 crisis. I mean, probably came out of after the death of Mao Zedong on forward. But how does this Middle Kingdom mentality influence China's approach to global leadership and cooperation? And define more of what I've said or whatever, but that's kind of the core of what I'm asking.
Yeah, so I think if I'm getting at what you have in mind, so I think part of it is that China has a sense of exceptionalism, much like American exceptionalism. There's a sense that it's special and different, and so it can act differently. And so the Middle Kingdom idea was, at the time, it was for a long time, it was the top player in the area, and it also is understandably proud of many of the amazing things that it's done, like inventions, theories, things like that. So it gets a little bit more risky, though, because when it's being used as a sort of nationalistic tool to prop up the support for the current regime by sort of demonizing the enemy. And so I think that the Middle Kingdom is a very understandable sort of belief system, and it was one that, again, Confucianism reinforced with the idea that countries, once they recognize the value and the superior morality of the Confucian system, they would be enculturated and they would adopt those customs, which in some cases is true, and in some cases that's history rewritten. Is that sort of what you're?
Yeah. So how does it? Yes, and so I'll just pull further. How does that influence what it does today with its global leadership? Do you see it manifesting as it engages with the world?
Yes, absolutely. So again, I think part of that's linked to the hierarchy, which we talked about, right? There's a sense of sort of entitlement, not unlike many other countries have had over time, but it also means that there's not necessarily the same sense of reciprocity. There's an idea that sort of China maybe deserves more. And again, in the Confucian idea, there's no equality in rights, right? It's about responsibilities based on your role. And so if you are more senior, the idea is, if you have less to worry about your own good, then you can spend more of your time being, a fair ruler to your people. And so, the senior sort of leaders, the emperors, they didn't have to worry about much. And even sort of the lower level leaders, they were taken care of. And that can lead to a lot of problems. But once again, if you expand this to sort of the international relations, the idea that China knows best, and sometimes, as almost like a parent in the Confucian model, it is a parent. Sometimes it has to do things which the kids shouldn't do, right? Because it knows best, and it's outside the system because it's system.
We're running shorter on time, so let's go to the audience questions. And so we have several. We had a lot of them that came in, and so these have been synthesized and pulled together. And so I've got several here for you. So this first one I'm going to ask you about is strategic culture and foreign policy. So how does China's strategic culture influence its foreign policy and its global behavior?
Yeah, so I think I talked about it a little bit, so I'll just summarize, which is basically there's a combination of this very dismal view of how countries behave. Countries are all out for the same thing, and that's power, and anything that they say or do differently is insincere. And so China should be doing the same thing. I think I kind of read this in my inner monologue, but when I hear sort of like, Minister of Foreign Affairs and propaganda, front work department talking about telling a good story about China in the world, in my head, there's some frustration with how they, or frustration in how they say that, because they're like, we're just doing what the United States and every other country does. And in fact, the United States and others probably do it better than us. So why is it, and this part I've had Chinese people, professors tell me this, like, we're not doing anything different. We're manipulating the media to make us look more favorable. Why is it that the United States, everyone looks at it and thinks this is great, and then they bash China for it? For that matter, the idea of friends, which is a whole nother topic about, the Confucian idea of friends and how it differs from a Western idea of friends. But I had, a Chinese professor friend one time say, that he was frustrated because somehow the United States always managed to get its friends to do its dirty work for it. And China, its only friends are, North Korea and Russia, and they don't like each other. So
yeah. Let's talk about China-ASEAN relations and regional dynamics. So the question asks, how will China's actions in the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal affect its relationships with ASEAN countries and regional stability?
Absolutely. So, looking a little bit more broadly at first, so China has and continues to prioritize what it calls its periphery for security. Again, understandable, because the 14 countries around it, all the history. And if you look at maps and think about all these different countries, it still has a lot of underlying tensions and disputes with many of them, and other ones are not considered stable. And so the potential source of disharmony and chaos are also seen as threats. And so China focuses on those. And if you look at sort of the scale of all the different countries around China, the ASEAN ones, it probably has the best relationships with, but also as China has become more dependent on the sea for economics, especially for natural resources coming in and manufacturing going out, that's where the ASEAN countries are. And so managing that is incredibly important. And we see this in sort of some of the progress that China's made with Laos, Cambodia, and even recently, fairly recently, Vietnam. China is focused on those, and it's looking at ways to sort of walk a fine line. And I think that most of the ASEAN countries understand this, but they also have been dealing with this for thousands of years and understand that they're smaller, and they don't have a whole lot that they can do. And so anytime they do anything, I think it's pretty notable. But I think China is sort of looks paternally at these countries and a little bit condescendingly as a result. But when it comes to how China's pursuing its sort of interests in the South China Sea in particular, you see a lot of the same sort of like coercion, right? You put one step foot over the line, and if you don't get caught, then you move a little further forward, and if you get caught, you take the foot back halfway back. And so I think that is how sort of that area expects China to behave, and therefore China gets away with it.
Next question's on Sino-Russian relations. So how deep is China's partnership with Russia, and what does it mean for global power dynamics?
Absolutely. So, it's really hard to say. I read a lot of sort of what China writes about this, which of course is loaded with all sorts of, predictable and maybe undetectable, agendas. My sense is that there's a camp, and I agree with this camp to some extent, that it's a pragmatic arrangement. There's so much deep-seated mistrust and hard feelings, and both of them are sort of these realpolitik powers, and so they understand how each works. It's all about power, and so as long as their interests are somewhat aligned, then they'll work together. But I do not think that there's any trust. That being said, when we talk about alliances, are they an alliance? As one of my good friends had mentioned a while ago, what is an alliance, right? I mean, some might argue it's something on a piece of paper as opposed to not on a piece of paper, but it's still just a piece of paper. And so we shouldn't, look at the development, of the trajectory of China and Russia relations and say it's not a real alliance, right? The alliance doesn't matter. The point is they have aligned interests, and they're working at least in the same direction and coordinating to some extent, if not, starting to work together. And so that's a serious issue. Now, what happens when sort of Russia, and the Ukraine, conflict sort of phases out? That'll be a little bit harder because they're both realpolitik powers, and so power matters. And right now, China definitely seems to have a lot more power. And so, in the Central Asia arena, the traditional arrangement has been that Russia remains the traditional security partner, and China is the economics partner. But both sides are jockeying for position as, Russia is becoming more dependent on China and others. And then the same thing with the land disputes on, Kamchatka, is that right? Kamchatka Peninsula.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I think you're spot on. What is an alliance? And whatever it is only for a definitive time and for a purpose. There is no such thing as whoever has there are no enduring alliances. They are shaped by some objectives. Some are longer, but still objectives. Global influence and perception. That's our next question. So is its growing international influence a threat to the West? And how are those countries then responding to that growing influence?
I think that's really hard to say.
Yeah.
So one, when people come to me and say, they're distraught because China's winning the global strategic messaging or public opinion, my first response to that is, really? Show me. And that's not to say they're not. It's just that how do you measure that, right? How do we know? And there's a couple ideas here and there, but there's also, having lived in China, one of the things that many expats in China, it's a hard place to live. Right? There's many lovely, lovely things about it, and I'm sad I probably never go back again. But it also is a very different culture, and so it's a hard place to live. And so there are people who, after some time there, start realizing that the Chinese model doesn't appeal. There's nothing appealing about it to most of the world. People don't look at that political system and say, we want that, but they do want the economics. And so, the question then becomes, we have the liberal democratic values, and we have the Chinese economic model, and they're related, even though there's some people who would argue they're not, or they don't want it to be, and they don't want to have to choose between these two. As we see from things like Huawei and TikTok and others, they're absolutely related. But if we ignore that for the moment, then the question is sort of which one's more powerful, right? And I don't know the answer to that. It's certainly not predetermined that the good guys will always win. And I've read a couple studies recently that were talking about how, for especially poorer countries, they care more about the economics than they do about the values, right? Maybe it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But I also wonder if there might be some buyer's remorse after it happens. And so I think that the values-based approach, we don't even need to amplify that, right? We just need to embody it. And that is enough. And then, for the economic aspect, we can and we should compete there as well.
Next question, military and security issues. How does China's military expansion in the South China Sea and the Horn of Africa impact regional global security?
South China Sea, East China Sea are much more concerning.
Okay.
I think that China doesn't yet look at distant shores and the seas in between in the Mahanian sea power way. It's still largely a more Mackinder, land power, where even the East China Sea, South China Sea are just larger buffer zones.
Yeah.
The other thing is, because of things like the Malacca Straits, which China talks about all the time, because it's a huge insecurity, because it's so dependent on especially energy going through the Malacca Straits, and a lot of the One Belt, One Road projects that are in China's periphery intended to bypass, or at least make it less vulnerable to the Malacca Straits. And I think we're not paying enough attention to some of them, especially ones like in Burma, Myanmar. So for the South China Sea and the East China Sea, I think China's sort of approach to it is risky for everyone who's sort of in that area, because it wants to be able to control that area. Now, it does it, I think, in part because it feels vulnerable and thinks that others who control it might be able to blockade or shut down, China's economy by, shutting the first island chain. But its increased militarization is only making things worse, right? It's because we know that China is more likely to use its military power, at least coercively, if not in physical force, to pursue its interests. And when other countries don't kowtow, if they don't, defer to Chinese priorities and Chinese interests, China's more likely to use that. And so it's a little bit less equitable in how it uses or considers the use of force to address, interests and conflicts of interest with other countries.
Here's the last question. Confucius Institutes. What did China use them for?
Yeah, again, I think that to some extent that China looked at them just as we look at they looked at Hollywood and things like that. Like, they are tools of influence. That's neither bad nor good. It depends how they're used for influence and what they do. And so the idea, again, the United Front Work Department, which is in charge of China's sort of global propaganda system, which is immense, says go out and tell China's story well, right? Like, make sure that everyone is saying good things about China. It's a war over global public opinion. And that's actually, we don't use those terms, and many of us don't think of it in that way. But to some extent, that's what we are trying to do as well, as we're trying to present all the good things about the United States. And so, the Confucius Institute was both. It was a way to give people, who couldn't go to China, the opportunity to learn more about all the great things that China has done and has to offer, and about its culture and language and food and all that. But it's also an opportunity to curry favor, to make sure that people are saying nice stuff, and where it crosses the line is where it aggressively, at least coercively, stifles any criticism. That's one of the big differences, I think, between, say, the United States and China. Is the United States, we invite criticism, right? Everyone criticizes, we take it, maybe we respond, we defend ourselves from time to time, verbally, but we don't get upset when someone disagrees with us. China, when someone disagrees with them, they punish, whether it's stopping buying pineapples or exporting critical earth minerals, and so that's a big difference that I think both South China Sea, East China Sea, and Confucius Institutes, that's what we need to be. That's the differentiator that we need to be aware of. We're
going to leave it there, but before I let you go, I want to ask you to give book recommendation for our audience. So, what have you come with?
Absolutely. So, before I do that, I wanted to recommend a couple articles.
Yep.
And I recommend this especially to senior U.S. government, because it should, every time I read them, it makes me uncomfortable. And I feel like if we want to understand, even if we don't agree with them, if we want to understand the Chinese perspective, we need to understand it, right? We need to be able to confront the things that we disagree with.
Yeah.
So after the Tiananmen Square massacre, the United States Congress mandated a report on Chinese human rights every 2 years. Very quickly thereafter, China adopted the same and does a report every 2 years on the state of human rights of the United States in the past year. It is incredibly uncomfortable to read. It's in English. You can just Google it. But one of the things it does is it shows sort of the insidiousness of Chinese propaganda, because it uses a lot of facts that are true, but the correlations and the causations aren't necessarily true.
Okay.
But at the same time, you read this and you're like, it makes you uncomfortable. They're calling out a lot of American, shortcomings that hopefully we're addressing.
Yeah.
Similarly, there's a one that came out recently called The State of Democracy in the United States, 2023, I think. It's another one worth reading. It's in English. They're not long.
Yeah.
And then if you really need to know about books, so there's a bunch, but I'm Peter Hessler. He's written a bunch. And not only do I suggest those because I think they're not political, which for the most part, they're sort of observational travel. But you get a much stronger sense of the good and the bad of China and the complexity of its culture and sort of how that helps explain some of the things that we see. But also I suggest it because in preparation for this, I wanted to, think about what did China think about Western books on China. So I went onto the Chinese internet and Googled around and looked for what are some of the books that China recommends to Chinese to read if they want to understand Western views of China. And his books came up over and over again. So one's called, I think, River Town, another one, Oracle Bones, and then there was a third one, I forget the name of it, but really good as well.
We'll put that on our book recommendation list. Lucas, thank you for being here. This has been a wonderful time together. I've really learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. As we conclude, understanding China's strategic culture requires appreciating both its Confucian roots and the realities of Realpolitik. By recognizing the interplay between these forces and engaging China with informed strategies, we can better navigate the challenges and opportunities in our global interactions. Now I encourage you to join us on August 30th for our next Security Nexus webinar, North Korea-Russia Alliance, Economic and Geopolitical Implications, with Rachel Min-Young Lee of the Stimson Center. In that session, we'll explore the evolving North Korea relationship and its political, economic, and domestic impacts on North Korea. From all of us at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, thank you for being part of this important conversation. I'm James Minnich, and until we meet again, aloha oi. As always, the opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of DKI APCSS, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.